You are listening to The Place We Find Ourselves. Today's episode focuses on how attachment styles play out in close relationships. I'm joined by Rachel Blackston, who is a therapist in Orlando, Florida. And Rachel begins today's conversation by reading an essay which she wrote about, love and war in her marriage. It's a beautiful and vulnerable piece that gives you a window into how insecure attachment plays out in a real-life marriage. I'm deeply grateful to Rachel for her willingness to dive headfirst into this very difficult and very important arena. You can read more about Rachel at rachelblackston.com. This is the final episode of Season 2. Season 3 will launch on July 1st. Please consider supporting the podcast financially if Season 2 has been helpful to you. You can do that by going to adamyoungcounseling.com and clicking on Support the Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Here we go. Okay, today I am joined by Rachel Blackston. Rachel, it is good to see you. And why don't you start by just sharing a little bit about who you are, where you are geographically?
Well, I am in Orlando, Florida, and I am a therapist. I'm also married to a therapist. So Michael and I together, we have founded Redeemer Counseling, and I consider it a huge honor to work as a therapist. It's just such a privilege.
And you're also a writer, and you're going to read one of your pieces that you wrote for Red Tent Living. And the piece is called The Civil Wars, and it's about attachment. It's about a lot of things, but it's about attachment. And so we're going to look at how our attachment style plays out in our most intimate relationships. And you write candidly about your attachment style and your husband's and how it plays out in your marriage. And you're going to read that. But before we do that, just for the listeners, if attachment is a new category for you, I highly recommend going back and listening to episodes 5 and 7, which lay out the foundation of attachment, what it is, why it matters so much. But by way of introduction or reminder, I will kind of summarize two of the attachment categories, avoidant attachment, which we're going to talk about today, and ambivalent attachment. So first, avoidant attachment. When your caregiver is often unavailable, when you're an infant, a toddler, or dismissive or rejecting, the child will develop an avoidant attachment. In other words, the child will become avoidant of connecting, of attaching. The child adapts, they're forced to, by avoiding closeness and emotional connection to the parent. Attachment is about feeling like your caregiver is there for you and responsive to you when you feel distressed, when you feel afraid or sad or mad. And in the case of avoidant attachment, when the child becomes distressed, his caregiver does not provide sufficient comfort, care, connection. And when the child tries to communicate his distress, his attempts have little to no effect on the parent. And so the predicament of the avoidantly attached child is that he's forced to try to calm himself and to regulate his own emotions. And that's avoidant attachment in a nutshell. And as you will soon hear in Rachel's story, her husband, Michael, is avoidantly attached. This is not a gender-specific thing. So, for example, men are not always avoidantly attached. I'm a man. I'm ambivalently attached. Rachel is a woman. She's ambivalently attached. But there's plenty of avoidantly attached women out there. Okay, ambivalent attachment in a nutshell. With ambivalent attachment, the child experiences her primary caregiver as inconsistent and at times intrusive. And so when the child becomes distressed, her caregiver may or may not provide soothing and comfort. It all depends on what is going on for the caregiver at that particular moment. In other words, at times, mom is attuned and responsive to the child's needs, but at other times, she's too caught up in her own emotional needs, her own pain, her own moods, to focus on being there for the child. And so the child learns that she can't depend upon mom to be attuned and responsive to her. Never knowing what to expect, the child develops a deep sense of anxiety and uncertainty about whether she can depend upon mom or not. So that's the core of ambivalent attachment. And I just wanted to kind of remind the listeners of those two categories because that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. Rachel, will you read your piece?
I would love to. The Civil Wars. A few months ago, my husband and I lay under our down comforter, which felt far too heavy for a mild Florida winter. I felt empty and bored after a long day with the kids, so I roused an argument with Michael as an attempt to connect with him. I griped and accused, firing bullets for all the ways he hadn't been thinking of me. My assaults turned Michael into a cold wall of aloofness and dismissive rebuttals. I rolled towards my nightstand, refusing to offer another word. I wanted him to feel the impenetrable shield of my back. I can trace these types of encounters all the way back to the beginning of our relationship, when we used to engage in monthly civil wars. I vividly remember one morning, only a few months into marriage, when a fight erupted about a ring of coffee that I left behind every day, despite countless reminders by my new husband that it bothered him. Before I could even think, the words, "I hate you," spewed out of my 27-year-old mouth. As I shared with a mentor about these monthly civil wars, she said, "You two are like a lighted match in a puddle of gasoline." 13 years later, after spending many hours working with couples in the counseling room, I've observed that we are not alone in this recipe for a perfect explosion. I find comfort in knowing that love and hate are veins in the same heart. My work as a therapist has taught me how the safety and intimacy of marriage can trigger emotions and body sensations that have been tucked away for decades. Time becomes irrelevant as trauma and attachment wounds inflicted against our younger selves surface in the present moment. At an unconscious level, we select a spouse as an attempt to resolve the pain of our childhood. According to psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, many traumatized people expose themselves seemingly compulsively to situations reminiscent of the original trauma. This process, called reenactment, is covertly at play during the dating phase. My husband had no idea that when we signed our marriage license, I was also giving him sole custody over several little girls. As a child, I learned that verbal barrages could get my blood pumping and make me feel alive in a desert of emotional needs. Still today, I feel a strange sense of calm and euphoria when grenades are hurled, and I actually feel panicked in the midst of distance and withdrawal. My little girl has high attachment needs and lives with voracious desire. Michael bears the brunt of my insatiability. On the contrary, when Michael's amygdala senses fear and danger, his heart finds safety behind a brick wall that he constructed as a young boy, a creative strategy to preserve a tender and brilliant boy with rich desire. When Michael is hunkered behind his wall, I feel an insatiable desire for connection. Rousing an argument actually soothes my system. That night in our Florida bedroom, after rolling away from Michael in bed, he tenderly whispered a prayer, inviting me to turn back and look at him. In soft words, he humbly asked if I could try to connect with him in a different way. His invitation disarmed my stubborn and exhausted soul. My little girl, covered in jagged shrapnel, had to strategically weigh the exhilarating power of her personal gridlock against the profound loneliness she felt inside. Minutes felt like hours. Then, like the rumblings of a small earthquake, I inched toward him, muscle by muscle, barely squinting at his soft brown eyes. As I took a deep breath, I gazed at the same eyes I looked into on our wedding night 13 years ago. My hands felt his skin, more dappled and rough now, with gray flecks in his beard. "That was a holy roll," he said with tears in his eyes. We prayed together that night, enveloped in the secure attachment of each other's arms, thanking God that he would bring together this perfect storm to heal, satiate, and teach us to love and be loved. Sometimes in the midst of working through childhood stories, I feel a sense of impatience, wishing the body and heart would heal faster so we could drink more deeply of this gift of marriage. In these moments, I draw on the words of my kind counselor who would remind me, we have all the time in the world. I'm grateful for the second chance marriage offers us to reenact our childhood hurts and create a different end to the story. I'm realizing that I have all of eternity to redeem my little girl and her one precious look at the world.
Oh, thank you. Can we go back through it and slow it down and talk through various parts? And I just want to go back to the opening paragraph where you say that you felt empty and bored after a long day with the kids. And so I roused an argument with Michael as an attempt to connect with him. This is such a brilliant sentence. You started a fight in an attempt to connect.
Right.
Some listeners will be like, huh? Put more words to how is it that starting a fight is a bid for connection for you, Rachel?
I think for me, there is no worse, scary, terrifying feeling than this just feeling of just emptiness and a feeling that I don't matter in this world. And so somehow, when I can start an argument and I see in my husband's face kind of this expression, I kind of see his blood starting to pump. It's like somehow this little girl in me gets a sense that now I matter.
Yes.
I know that it sounds like such a young, primitive place, but to me, that's just the sense of disconnection is so much worse for me than the intensity of conflict.
Yes. And I'm going to talk about someone named Sue Johnson throughout this episode. She is the kind of founder and developer of something called emotionally focused therapy, or EFT. And Sue Johnson, in my mind, has cracked the code on understanding intimate relationships. And here's what she says. She says, what couples and therapists often do not see is that most fights are really protests over emotional disconnection. Underneath all the distress, partners are asking each other, can I count on you? Depend on you? Are you there for me? Will you respond to me when I need you? The anger, the criticism, the demands are really cries to their lovers, calls to stir their hearts, to draw their mates back in emotionally and reestablish a sense of safe connection. And when you talk about seeing Michael's eyes come alive when you pick a fight, that's what you're talking about. You feel a sense of connection. And like you said, you matter to him.
Right.
And that soothes your heart.
It does.
And that is what we mean when we talk about ambivalent attachment. Ambivalently attached people get dysregulated when there's this sense of my partner's not there for me. They don't care about me. They are perfectly fine doing life by themselves, and I don't matter to them. And it absolutely dysregulates us, because if you think about it from the perspective of like a 6-month-old in the crib,
oh yeah,
it's as if mom has just peered her head in because you are in need and you need comfort and care, and then she just walks right by the room.
Yes.
And for a 6-month-old, you have to understand that's terror. And it is a bodily state of massive dysregulation, massive cortisol, massive terror. And then we grow up and we get married, and your husband's on his iPhone, and you're trying to express yourself at some level. And does he care about me? And your bodily experience is not all that different than the 6-month-old.
Oh yes, the iPhone is such a hot button for us. I mean, I get so triggered, and I know that he's kind of unwinding some days, and but I mean it's like, look at my face. When I watch the still face experiment, I can look at this child and see the distress of just trying to get that mother space back. I can see myself in my marriage.
Yeah. And so Rachel just mentioned the still face experiment, which I'm sure I've talked about in a previous episode. But if this is the first time you're hearing about it, you need to do yourself a favor. And it's about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. But if you go to YouTube and type in the still face experiment, it will illustrate better, frankly, than anything I know of, what happens inside the body of a child, in this case, a 1-year-old child, when attunement with their primary caregiver is broken for a sustained period of time. And what happens with the child is that they get massively dysregulated. And it's a great illustration of what can happen in our bodies when we move from an attuned caregiver or an attuned spouse to someone who's just still-faced, hence the name of the experiment. And you picked a fight with Michael so that you could see his eyes move in recognition that you matter to him. And when you saw it, you were soothed.
Oh, yes.
And so as you continue in this piece, you go on to say that your work as a therapist has taught you how the safety and intimacy of marriage can trigger emotions and body sensations that have been tucked away for decades. There's 2 things in this sentence. Number 1, the safety and intimacy of marriage. You're naming that marriage can be it is a place of safety and intimacy. Now, for many people, marriage doesn't feel safe at all. What do you mean when you refer to the safety of marriage?
Well, a couple of things. I think the first thing is that really the covenantal relationship of marriage. I mean, Michael and I can both say that we chose one another kind of as the one that we deemed safe. And so the places that we sort of act out with one another in marriage, no one else on the planet gets exactly those same places. That's the first thing that I mean here. The second piece is that I really believe that when Scripture says that we will leave our mother and father and cling to our spouse, there really is, in terms of our brain and our bodies, there is no one as significant as our spouse. I mean, I think people, when a lot of times when they first meet their spouse, they might say something like, "Oh, I feel like I've known you forever. I can't imagine my life without you." And I really think that a lot of that is because there is something so primitive in the brain that this person then represents. I think for myself, because I have had such a deep fear of abandonment, marriage has given me the sense of this is the one who will not abandon me. Now, with saying that, there are certain ways that are attachment styles that I reenact my past in that Michael's own avoidancy and sort of his, he can kind of have this commitment that you take care of yourself and I take care of myself. Well, that reenacts the abandonment, which I didn't quite realize when we signed up. But I do know that there's something so beautiful. There is some safety in our marriage of just this is the person that will be a witness to my life, that I will work out these deep parts of me with.
And so in the context of marriage, emotions in your heart, sensations in your body that you write have been tucked away for decades get evoked and get triggered. What do you mean tucked away for decades?
Anybody that kind of knows me in my current life probably could not imagine me spewing the words, "I hate you, Adam." I mean, I don't think anyone who knows me, who's in my life. And so when I spoke those words, they scared me. They shocked me. They were very reminiscent of really kind of early engages that I had with my father, these kind of back and forth places that have literally been tucked away since I was a little girl, and then in most areas of my life do not come out. And here they kind of shocked me.
And when you talk about bodily sensations being evoked in or triggered in the context of marriage, when it comes to navigating the tumult of marriage, there has to be an attunement to our bodily sensations. And it sounds like you have progressively, over the course of your marriage, become increasingly attuned to your own dysregulation, your own bodily sensations when things get yucky with Michael.
Yes. Oh, this has been such a bloody battle. It's really caused a lot of heartache in that in those early years, I didn't have a way to soothe other than to kind of push and push as much as I could in argumentation. But as I've started to, through my own therapeutic process, as I've started to find places where I can care for this little girl in me that is so desperate to be seen, so desperate to know that her needs matter. As I've been doing, I do a lot of breathing. We do this very simple exercise, but it's so helpful that we just kind of call the 3 minutes, where we just stop and we try to speak where we're at, and the other person just repeats. And then the most beautiful part of it is at the end, Michael will say, "Is there anything else?" And I will tell you that 9 times out of 10, we will say, "Yes, there's something else." And by the time we're kind of heard, I feel like my body is just more relaxed. My breathing is more relaxed. And so as I found ways to really ultimately let God father and mother that little girl, and it has helped so much, so that all of the weight of her is not on him. I mean, I literally married thinking that he was going to bear all that this girl wanted and needed. And it was such an unfair setup.
Let's talk about this 3-minute exercise, because I love it. This 3-minute exercise can save a marriage.
Yes.
And what it is you actually get 3 minutes where someone is attuned to you and responsive to you and hearing your heart, hearing about what's going on in your emotions and in your body. And it regulates you. It soothes you. It brings you to a place of rest.
Right. It's so good. It's so good.
And it's so important. And again, we have to link it to attachment, because this is what we were all needing as children. You wouldn't need to do the 3-minute exercise if you were securely attached, because your body would naturally know in its core attunement, responsiveness. It would know that you're heard. It would know that anytime you need to bring your needs or concerns to the other person, of course they're going to be there for you. You just know it. Your brain is different when you're securely attached. But when we're not, this 3-minute exercise can change everything.
Yes, it feels like mirroring. It feels, and we really help one another by saying, you do not have to agree with me here, because we're more reticent to do it for one another if I have to agree. But to mirror and say, I hear this. We actually, Michael and I did a marriage conference a couple weeks ago, and we did a live conflict resolution that we had not done. We had not talked through, and we got up on stage and we went back, but we wanted to show the 3 minutes, and it was so good. And we didn't hold anything back with it. And it's just afterwards, yes, my whole bodily system is just more at rest.
Yes. And so you mentioned a word already, but I want to come back to it. And it's the word reenactment. In your piece, you say that at an unconscious level, we select a spouse as an attempt to resolve the pain of our childhood. And then you quote Bessel van der Kolk saying, many traumatized people expose themselves seemingly compulsively to situations reminiscent of the original trauma. And then you say, hey, this is called reenactment. Reenactment is a thing. It happens all the time, and it particularly happens in marriage. Can you say a bit, what do you mean when you say reenactment? How has that played out for you?
When Michael and I first met one another, I'm an Enneagram 3, so I've always been pretty driven, pretty independent. And so there was something of that felt safe to him in the sense of this is a woman in his own attachment style that is not going to need and require a lot from me. She has a lot of independence. And so that felt safe and soothing to him.
So for Michael, with an avoidant attachment, he meets you, an Enneagram 3, who is on the surface independent, and we can say it this way, not needy, and is not going to need me to tend to her. And inside of him, he's like, jackpot. Why for him was that home?
He was very scared of being smothered, of someone who was going to consume him. Now, what he didn't know, and we didn't outrightly talk about, is that I had some extremely deep needs that were just under the iceberg. And so he meets this woman. I'm really kind of driven, pretty motivated, seem pretty independent, and he's very drawn in. For me, the thing about Michael is that his kindness, I felt like I could soak up like a sponge. I mean, he is just a really tender man. And it's like I just met him, and there's just something that just compulsively felt like this is the one who can not only be safe for me, but can fill this deep sense in me that I am not loved. And so I met him, and, I wasn't quite as aware of sort of this sort of avoidant attachment style until we got into those first couple of years, and we're kind of hashing this all out.
Yes. And so the setup for the reenactment is Michael thinks he has a woman who kind of has it all together and won't ask much of him emotionally. And that feels really comfortable for him because he has had to learn how to tend to his own heart,
right,
and self-soothe. And he is very allergic to anyone that might smother him based on his upbringing. And he meets you and he thinks, no way she's going to smother me. She's fine. She's got it all together. And he can breathe. And so you get married. But underneath it, like you said, underneath the tip of the iceberg, there are vast unmet emotional needs in you from your ambivalent attachment, where you actually are going to ask him to tend to you. But the reenactment is what? How did the reenactment play out?
Well, it really became, for me, a lot about kind of moving the immovable object in those first couple of years, because as the avoidant attachment style, again, which was at an unconscious level when we met, as it started to play out, it became this sort of challenge. Like, if I can get a distant man to love me, by either starting conflict, by my neediness. I mean, there was just this sense of, can I do this? Can I work through something that was unaddressed in my own family and in my own world in marriage? And it became so all-consuming. It was just far too much for Michael to ever bear, and far too much than he should have had to ever bear. And so that's when we kind of first got this, wow, you all are like a lighted match and a puddle of gasoline. Like, the one thing that you really need is the thing that it was just like the sparks.
And if I'm hearing you right, the gasoline is the sole custody of those little girls in you.
Right.
So say a bit, what do you mean about these little girls?
There's several little girls, some of them from trauma that I've experienced, some of them from my family, but just this sense, these exiled parts of me that needed a lot of attunement, a lot of care, to know that they weren't going to be left. A lot of them that had a ton of just fearfulness and insecurity. And so sort of marriage comes, and all of these little girls start to say, I'm safe now. And they start to come out in these first couple of years of marriage. And again, I had set up the system where he was gonna father them. He was going to tend to them. And again, just far too much for him to ever have been responsible for.
Yes. And there it is. There is the recipe for explosive fights, for days of silence. I don't know how it played out in your marriage, but this is what we mean when we talk about reenactment. Each of us bring unhealed woundedness into our marriages, and it becomes a perfect storm. It becomes a perfectly designed train wreck. And if we stay in it, it can actually become very redemptive and healing. And that's what your piece is really pointing to as we continue. So let's continue. But before we get to the part where there's repair, and it's so sweet, but before we get there, there's a paragraph in your piece where you just confess that you feel panicked in the midst of distance and withdrawal, but you feel a strange sense of calm, and you even use the word euphoria, when grenades are hurled. And so what you're talking about here is the way your brain has come to regulate your affect. I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about affect regulation. And when grenades are hurled, when there's engagement, when you can see that Michael's eyes are on you and attentive to you and responsive to you, you feel a sense of calm.
Right. I will feel sheer panic when what he would describe as he's behind his wall. And then as soon as he comes out from the wall and we're more firing grenades at one another, I am all of a sudden soothed. I mean, it's like my body is soothed in this kind of negative pattern, which is very familiar to me. And so this just kept happening time and time again, until we really got some help outside of ourselves with this.
And what you're talking about, there's a term for it in emotionally focused therapy, and it's the term action tendencies. We both partners in a relationship have action tendencies where they move toward or they move away from their partner. And these action tendencies need to be decriminalized. They are understandable in light of our stories. And so for Michael, the language that he uses is he goes behind a wall. There's a moving away from you behind a wall. And that is the action tendency of his body when there's conflict with you. And for you move toward him in a posture of fight. That's it's the action tendency of your body. And this happens in every intimate relationship. These action tendencies have to be named and they have to be decriminalized. Neither partner is doing anything quote unquote wrong, which doesn't mean it can't be changed. It has to be changed. There has to be a repentance, if you will, but the action tendencies first have to be understood as so reasonable in light of your respective stories.
I love that because one of the couples that have been very influential to me is Kay and Milan Yurkovich, and they wrote the book How We Love. I love what they do with attachment in marriage. And one of the things that Milan says is that you need to get a PhD in how your spouse was wounded. And I will say that I can now say I am so thankful that Michael has had that wall. And I am so thankful that there was something in me in my little girl and in me now even that can find a sense of aliveness or soothing by moving into this level of argumentation, even if we've had to both realize that those parts we don't need them as much as we once did, but I am thankful for them. And so that I love how you said that you're not inherently doing anything wrong, that it really is just a sense to be compassionate and really thankful for our protective strategies.
Part of what I'm hearing you say is you're blessing his wall because you know what it was like for him as a boy.
Right.
And if he had not developed this wall, he would not have survived.
Right.
And you're blessing that, even though that wall costs you immensely.
Right.
And when you're able to get a PhD in the wounding of your spouse, you are able to bless their action tendencies. You're able to bless how they show up when things get hard. And it's a blessing that doesn't leave you stuck. It actually creates the opportunity for dancing differently, which is what happens in this story. So let's return to it, because that night, here's your writing, that night in our Florida bedroom, after rolling away from Michael in bed, he tenderly whispered a prayer, inviting me to turn back and look at him. This is just so sweet. So what do you imagine, and you may remember, what do you imagine happened in your body as your husband began to pray?
I'll tell you, it was, and I can pull it up in my body right now, is honestly, it was so terrifying because I am so committed in those moments. I'm so committed to, I think, I talk about my impenetrable back. I'm so committed to my push away and so committed to really getting a form of intimacy in there that involves a level of kind of, can I get him to be angry enough back, that for him to come in tenderly actually was very terrifying. And so I kind of, for several minutes, it felt like hours, but for several minutes, I just, like, my body was just full of fear. And yet there was something of an invitation, like, oh, like this is actually a moment in the heavenly realms. Can I, like, this moment actually matters for eternity. Will I turn to this kind man, or will I stay absolutely committed to the way that I've always done it? And so I want to say that it was wonderful to hear, but honestly, it was just terrifying when he first said it.
He is reaching.
He is, and in the most beautiful way. I mean, it's like the thing that I wanted from the very beginning of the story, and this is one evening that just kind of goes on for several hours, but from the very moment of the story, it's like he is now coming in, and he's actually in some ways blessing my turn away. He's inviting me to something, but he's not forcing it, and he's not demanding it. He's just saying, will you, he uses this language more than I, but he does it in such a beautiful way. He said, sweetheart, can you access another space? And so in that moment, he's saying, will you turn and look at my eyes and get the mirroring that you've wanted from the very beginning?
And this is about repair.
Mm-hmm.
It's about repair. We do not need our partners to stop hurting us. We do not need our partners to stop hurting us. What we need from our partners is repair.
Right.
The difference between a marriage where you can breathe and a marriage where you can't is repair. When you boil it all down, repair and secure attachment. Repair is at the core of secure attachment. Here's the core of secure attachment. When there is relational rupture, the securely attached individual knows that repair is inevitable and that it will be here shortly. In other words, secure attachment is embodied hope. It's the bodily based sense that we will soon feel close and connected again, and it will come about without either one of us having to sacrifice our individuality. And when Michael turned to you and said, can you access something different? He's inviting you to reconnection. He's inviting repair. And he's not asking you to sacrifice your individuality, but he is asking you to join him in receiving his care. And in that moment, you said yes. It took you a little bit of time, but your heart, your body said yes. And his words are so accurate. That was a holy roll when you rolled towards him. Say something about the holiness of that for you.
I just remember my husband has the deepest, warmest brown eyes. All of our little girls have the same eyes. But when I turned around and his eyes are filled with tears, and he knew, I mean, to have the witness to my life that knows how deeply committed I am to my push away, and to know it's like he was bearing witness to what it took for me to roll over towards him. And he just had such deep gratitude for that. And he's like, thank you for your repentance. Thank you for moving towards me. Thank you for allowing me to love you and to have a corrective experience. I mean, as I looked in his eyes, I just looked at his eyes and remembered the eyes that I looked at on our wedding night, and it was just so beautiful. But the difference between his eyes in that moment and his eyes in the wedding night is, on the wedding night, he did not know all that I would take him through, all the bloody battles that we would enter together. And yet to know that I was still loved, to know that he loved me and that he still invited me to more, it was sacred, holy ground.
Yes. And it cost both of you immensely to get to that moment. And it was a holy, sacred moment. And in your piece, you continue and say, we prayed, we enveloped in the secure attachment of each other's arms. And then you say this, thanking God that he would bring together this perfect storm to heal. Say a bit about how can a perfect storm bring healing in a marriage?
That's a hard one, isn't it? It's just this idea that because of the way that both Michael and I kind of found each other at this unconscious level, that we have access to the most raw and tender places of each other's story, that we also have the opportunity to love and to be tender and kind to the places that really no one in my world has access to the way he does. In that moment, there is no one on this planet who could look at me with those tender eyes that would be more impactful, because there's no one who has put up with the bloodshed. The forgiveness and the beauty and the redemption in that is so beautiful and just marvelous.
Yes. And part of what you're saying is that it's because Michael has seen your most tender, vulnerable, terrified, angry, needy parts, those little girls that you mentioned. It's because he knows all of you, that his willingness and desire to be in relationship with you is so powerful and so healing.
Right.
Because it's like, this man knows me and he wants to be in relationship with me.
Right.
And he knows all about me. And it's cost him immensely, and he still wants me to roll over and look at him.
Right.
And that is, there's no other way to say it. That's what we mean when we talk about being created in the image of a triune God. We are designed for that level of intimate connection, acceptance, and embrace. And there's nowhere like an intimate relationship where we are known all the way down and yet embraced.
Yes. And I think Jesus had skin on that night to me, and it was through my husband. I mean, the embrace of being held after really just a night where I just wouldn't, in some ways, wouldn't let it go. Right. I just kind of kept pushing for this intimacy. And then here it was offered to me. And his forgiveness was offered to me, and the embrace of that. And it was just beautiful. And so there my little girl she felt safe, and it was so healing for her.
Yeah. And the bottom line is that moments like this heal our hearts, by which I mean they rewire our brains. I mean, if only we had the technology to put you in an fMRI during that moment. Your brain was rewiring massively and very, very quickly. There were parts of your brain that were getting connected in the midst of love, that rewired neural networks that for you have kept you dysregulated at the slightest hint of abandonment. And it doesn't mean that you're never dysregulated anymore. It just means that you're more healed, and frankly, you're more securely attached. And it's a gift. And frankly, we have to acknowledge how much power we have as a spouse to bring healing to our spouse. Like, the power that Michael had that day is immense.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful. And again, the piece was called Civil Wars because there has been casualties, but the absolute beauty of that moment was worth it.
Rachel, thank you so much for your honesty, your vulnerability, your willingness. I mean, frankly, it's such a gift to give the listeners a window into the civil wars of your marriage, and frankly, the redemption and the healing, not just in your marriage, but in your own heart through your spouse, through your relationship with this man.
Thank you so much for inviting me.